Hi, my name's Louise Allcroft. I'm Chief Exec and co-owner of Complement Genomics Limited, also known as DadCheck. Our company has been going in excess of 16 years now, and our main area of business is paternity testing. And that's what we're going to cover today, and that's DNA testing in family law. So the areas we're going to cover today are DNA testing and why do we need it, the legal aspects of DNA testing, informed consent, parental responsibility, how we actually conduct the DNA test in the laboratory, how we interpret the results, and also a small section on wills and probate. So just to let you know that all the laboratories, such as our own, that work with the Ministry of Justice are ISO 17025 accredited, which basically means anybody on that list, on the Ministry of Justice list, which is reviewed on an annual basis, has laboratories that perform to a certain international standard, which basically means there are quality management systems in place, and also the scientific staff know exactly what they're doing and have proper protocols and processes in place to make sure the quality and the integrity of those results that we generate will stand up in court. So what is DNA? DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So now you can see why we call it just DNA. It's the genetic blueprint that makes you, me have blue eyes, and me female, and lots of other different things as well. Unless, of course, you have an identical twin, and in those cases, you're actually genetic clones of each other. There is no way we can distinguish one identical twin from another. You inherit your DNA half from mum and half from dad. Now, DNA itself is stored in 46 chromosomes. That's actually 22 pairs, numbered 1 to 22 in descending order of size, and also the sex chromosomes. Now, if you're a female, you'll have 2 X chromosomes, and in a male, you'll have an X and a Y. You'll see a scanning electron micrograph of the X and Y chromosomes. The large one is the X, and the little dinky one is the Y chromosome. So this is basically our own unique recipe. The next slide I'm showing you is a typical what we call a female karyotype. So this is all of the chromosomes all lined up in order of size, numbered, like I said, from 1 to 22 down to the X chromosomes just on the far side there. And as you can see, they've got very unique characteristics, and they're stained black and white using a special stain so we can see all the regions of DNA that we're interested in. What is the theory behind DNA testing? Well, in each individual cell, we have 3,000 million pieces of DNA, all sorted into small, tiny bases known as A, C, G, and T. And these in different combinations form genes and make me who I am and you who you are. Now, some of these regions are coding, which are very useful. They make proteins, and that tells you what colour eyes you have or whether you're predisposed to a disorder or anything like that. The other regions, we didn't really know what they were. They were known as junk pieces of DNA. They sat there, didn't seem to have any purpose. But in the 1980s and early 1990s, a researcher at Leicester University, Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, discovered very good use for them, and that is as STRs, short tandem repeats. These are regions of DNA that are really variable between people. And what we do as a DNA testing laboratory is look at 15 specific regions of DNA. We refer to them as markers or loci, and they exist in different forms in the population. Some people will have little building blocks of repeats, maybe 16 repeats, and another individual in the same region may have only 14 repeats. So we can build up a picture. And these are the individual regions, these loci, that we use to ascertain whether or not a person is related to one or another. Okay, one of the other regions we look at is a gene called amelogenin. Now, this is very special because it exists on both the X and the Y chromosomes, and these are the sex chromosomes that determine whether you're female or male. So by looking at an individual DNA profile without even seeing who the donor is, we can immediately ascertain whether this individual was indeed male or female. So this is what we do in the laboratory. We look at these markers to ascertain relationships, usually paternity, sometimes maternity as well. And we refer to these as inclusions or exclusions. We'll talk about that later. So when can it help? Well, we can use DNA testing and looking at these regions of DNA in many scenarios. Most common are obviously paternity, but there's a list here behind me of all the different other biological relationships that we can use DNA testing for to ascertain whether or not they exist or not. Siblings, that's brothers and sisters. That could be full sibling tests or half sibling tests, i.e. they only have one biological parent in common. Avuncular, what we're meaning there is we're looking at aunts and uncles. So that's very useful in an instance, for example, where the potential father is sadly deceased or cannot be found. You can actually look at his close relatives, for example, a full brother or a full sister. We can get some really good results with that, which we'll come on to later. Grandparentage tests. And in other cases, more and more often now, we're doing a lot of work in social services where all of those tests that we've just mentioned above do come into play on a fairly routine basis. Increasingly now, we're seeing immigration cases coming through, which we'll talk about in one of the other sessions. Surrogacy, certainly for cases overseas as well, which again we'll speak about later in this session, and in wills and probate too. We won't touch on forensics, but obviously you're probably aware that we can use DNA testing at scene of crime investigations to put somebody at the scene of a crime or not. Now, cousins are often asked about, and to be honest, they only share approximately 8 to 12% of their DNA in common. So when you're only looking at maybe 15 regions of DNA as markers, it's not really worth looking into, to be quite honest. So we do not do cousin DNA testing. We don't find it of any use to ourselves or indeed our clients. So the legal aspects of court-directed testing. So our company, and there's probably about 8 or 10 now on the Ministry of Justice's list. This list is reviewed on an annual basis, and as we said before, companies have to prove that they comply with industrial guidelines, guidelines set by our industry, for example, the Human Tissue Act, data protection, and of course run laboratories that meet the 17025 accreditation standard. More about this can be actually found on the United Kingdom Accreditation Services website. So if you're interested in that, please go have a look. The Ministry of Justice's list can be found on the Home Office site. If you just put a search in for parentage testing, you'll find the most recent list. So one of the key things is when we're collecting somebody's sample is we cannot just take it from them. We have to have their informed consent. And this is where the human tissue guidelines do come into play. So all companies have to adhere to the Human Tissue Act of 2004, which allows us to only work on those samples where appropriate and qualifying consent is actually in place. And we need that in a written form on one of the consent forms that we send out with all of our kits. So informed consent means that you obviously understand the nature and the consequences of this DNA test. You know when you are consenting to take part in this test, what the repercussions potentially could be. And also it has to be voluntary. This cannot be done under duress or forced in any way. And at any point during the DNA testing process, whether it's before they've given a sample or indeed when the samples are in the laboratory, any donor is entitled to withdraw their consent. And at that point, work stops and the samples are destroyed. At the end of the day, the lab is just a temporary custodian of that person's DNA sample. Now then, when we're talking about children, most of obviously the paternity tests conducted in the labs within the UK and all over the world, no doubt, are involving children usually under the age of 16. Now, they are not allowed to sign on behalf of themselves. There are certain cases of guilty competence that you can look at, but therefore a medical professional needs to assess that child to see whether or not they actually understand the implications of the test. So as a rule of thumb, any child under the age of 16 cannot consent for themselves, and instead it must be an individual with what we call parental responsibility for that child, must be present when the child has his or her sample collected, and they must sign on behalf of that child. More of information about parental responsibility can be found on our website, and there's a frequently asked questions section there. If you want to refer to the Children's Act 1989, you can find some more details there too. Now, so who actually does have parental responsibility for a child? 99 times out of 100 in all the tests that we undertake, it's the child's mother. Okay, so she's usually the one who needs to know about the test, be present when the child has their samples collected, and of course sign on behalf of the child. But sometimes that's not always possible, and it could be another individual. And sometimes it's the actual alleged father, the child's father, who has parental responsibility for the child. But it's not always that easy, and there are certain hoops that the gentleman must pass through in order to prove that he actually does indeed have parental responsibility, because this is not automatically transferred to him upon birth of the child, unlike the mother. So especially in those cases where the gentleman is actually not married to the mother. So he cannot claim parental responsibility unless he acquires it by some of the following reasons. You'll find these on the slide next to me, but we'll just go through them. So obtaining a court order, registering a legally written agreement with the mother's consent, marriage to the child's mother, being granted a residence order, and actually having his name on the child's birth certificate for any births registered after December 2003. Now that can be quite a difficult point because a lot of men are actually on the child's birth certificate who were born pre-2003 who think because they're on there they must have PR. They don't. Now, it's not just always parents who actually have parental responsibility for the children. Many of our cases, when we're working with social services, the child's in care and the local authority may have some form of order, such as an interim care order in place. And in those situations, then a social worker or member representative of the local authority is allowed to sign on behalf of the child. Other people can get it by appointment as a guardian, maybe a grandparent, for example. There could be a court order in place that says basically no matter what, we actually don't need written consent, as it were, because a DNA test must be undertaken to prove this child's parentage. And as we said before, just the local authority has some form of interim care order in place as well. But for any of these, really, we do need to see evidence of this. And this is why when orders are placed, we always ask the first question when we have the child's details is, can you please let us know who has parental responsibility? Because one of the first things that we shall do when those samples and consent forms come back to us is make sure the right person has signed for that child. If not, we are not allowed to process that sample until we get some proof. So once we've got consent, it may be that some of the questions from the family quite rightly will be, well, how long is it going to take? How am I going to get these results? What happens to my DNA? And I'm the mum, why on earth do I have to take part in the test? Which gets asked quite a lot, as you're probably aware. So how the tests are conducted. Well, once the samples come back into the laboratory, the samples being cheek cell swabs, there is no requirement at all for blood. Cheek cells are just as good as blood cells, and to be honest, when you're dealing with very young children, it's a much less painful and less traumatic procedure putting a swab in a child's mouth as opposed to drawing blood with a needle. But once the samples come in, the first thing we do is check all the consent forms, make sure everything's in place and the right people have signed the consent forms. We need to have certified photographs of all the donors in place to say that the individual who's physically taken the samples from these individuals can certify that the photo that they have provided with the consent forms and samples does indeed resemble the person from whom they've just taken the sample from. Okay? Also, once the samples come back in, the first thing we do is actually visually inspect the cheek cell swabs. Most of the time they are absolutely fine and perfect, but sometimes you can get a little bit of dirt or discoloration on the swabs, and at that point it will be raised as an issue and we'll contact the ordering party, usually a solicitor or social worker, to see if it's okay to go ahead with that. Most of the time you can get a result from this, but it's always wise to warn the family in advance that there may be issues and resampling may be required. Once everything's been logged in, the samples are then transferred to the laboratory where the actual work takes place. What happens there is the DNA is extracted, and it goes through a process of extraction, amplification, and then analysis, and we'll go on to that in the next few slides. So the slide you can see behind me is an image of a swab. It's just a cheek cell swab. It looks like a Long Johnson's cotton bud. So that goes into the laboratory. We extract DNA from these cells, and then we put it through a process. We call it amplification, but it's just like chemical photocopying. It takes DNA, which exists as 2 copies per cell, to approximately 14 million copies. And this is something now that we can't actually see it in the test tube, but the machines that we use can actually visualize those and show the data for us. What happens then, once we've done all this chemical photocopying, we're incorporating very tiny fluorescent tags into the growing strands of DNA. So when we run them on the next machine, where you can see under the heading separation, as the DNA fragments pass through this machine, it's through a process what we know as electrophoresis. Basically, the smallest fragments of DNA run really quickly, and the largest fragments move rather slowly down. So what you get is a ladder, and it just looks like a barcode, what you find at the end of your baked beans tin when you go to Tesco's. It's a little barcode, but this is coloured, and each of those little coloured strips represents one of these regions, these loci, that we are studying to establish the biological relationships. The next stage you can see the image is what's called analysis, and there's a small segment of an image of what we know as a DNA profile, and that's the final product. And each of those profiles, whether you look at mine or yours, were going to be different. Now, what we have now is two images. We have two children. We've got child 1, known as John Doe, and then we've got child 2, known as Jane Doe. And if you look at the bottom section of each of those, you'll see at the bottom left-hand corner of each of those profiles, an X and a Y for John, and Jane, you'll just see a single band which has a single X. So we know straight away that we are dealing with a male, John Doe, and a female, Jane Doe. Second page, we have two potential fathers known as John Smith and Mike Jones. Again, if you look at those DNA profiles, you can see all the bands. It looks like an ECG, but each of those regions are the little bands we were talking about, those little repeat regions that are unique in each individual. Now, if we look at the first one for John Smith, in the top left-hand corner, now that marker is known as D3S. Okay, that means it's located on chromosome 3. And if you look at it for John Smith, he has a 16 and 17. So it means that that particular region, he has 16 repeats and 17 repeats. If you go ahead to Mike Jones, you can see he, at the same region, has two different numbers, 15 and 18. So again, you can see already, by just looking at two regions, we've already got differences. So when you're multiplying that through and looking at 15 different regions, you suddenly get a very powerful set of data, and this is the power of DNA profiling. You know, to put it in a nutshell, it's almost like playing bingo, because what we're going to be doing is matching these regions with the child, or not, as the case may be. Now then, this is a profile of a female. This is the child's mother, or the children's mother. And again, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the X, single X, because she's got two copies of the X chromosome. So we know it's obviously a female. Now, one of the questions that you will be asked, as we've said before, is, well, I'm the child's mother. I know I gave birth. So why do you need to test me? Well, it's really, really, really useful, because we know every child inherits half its DNA from its mother, the other half from its biological father. The first thing we can do when we have a mother and child is look at the regions of DNA shared between that child and its mother. And then we use the mother as a filtration system, use her DNA to get rid of all those bits of DNA in the child that we know can have only come from her. Therefore, the bits left in each of those separate 15 regions can have only come from that child's true biological father. And if any of the men that we have tested are indeed that child's father, then they have to match that child at every single one of those remaining regions. No questions asked. It has to be a perfect match. Okay, and that's what we're going to work through now. Now, this is a very numerical slide, shall we say. It's tables of data. So what we have here in the top section, you can see two tables, and it says exclusion. So what we're looking at here, we've got results for child 1 and child 2, but only against the alleged father. We've completely wiped out the mother at this stage, and this is what we're going to do, is demonstrate to you why it's so important and so very useful to include the child's mother in these sorts of tests. So if you look at the results for child 1 and child 2 against father 2, it's saying that all of these, child 1 and child 2, the alleged father number 2 cannot be either of their fathers. And when you look, this is why, because if you look, for example, at D3S, you can see alleged father 2 is 1617 and the child is 1618. So we have a match, 16 and 16. So where you can see designation, we've got something called INC. That means it's an inclusion. They've matched. It's like bingo. You go to the next marker, THO1. Again, that the alleged father is 6'6", the child is 6'9.3". 6 and 6, we have a match, so on and so forth. But when we look at the next marker, D21, so this is a little region of DNA located on chromosome 21, you can see there's something that's not quite right. So the alleged father 2 is 32, 32.2, but the child is 27, 29. That child and that father do not match. As you go along the table, you can see there's different numbers of inclusions, but most importantly, a number of exclusions. Now, how do I know how many DNA regions we have to not have matching in order for me to say confidently, there is no way that this guy can be the biological father of that child? We need a minimum of 3 regions. That's all. It doesn't sound a lot, but that is enough when you do the statistics to say, well, how likely is it that this gentleman still is the dad, but he's got these 3 areas not matching between him and the child? The probability is virtually 0%, if not 0. And the more exclusions, mismatches you have between father and child, it just plummets down to 0. And you can see for child 1 and child 2 against alleged father 2, he is not the dad full stop. You can see for child 1 we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 regions that are not matching, and in child 2 we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's pretty conclusive. Now, if you look to the table at the bottom of this particular stream, we've now added the mum into the mix, just in this case for child 2, just for demonstration purposes. Okay, now if you just compare the two different tables, child 2 just with alleged father 2, but this time child 2 with the mother included as well, you'll see some of those inclusions, those little green boxes in the table including mother's data, have now turned from an inclusion to an exclusion. And this is why it's so important to include mums, because sometimes you can allocate matches between the alleged father and child because you think they are, but in fact, if the mother had been included in this analysis, they wouldn't have been a match between father and child. They would have, in fact, been a match between the mother and child. And that's why it's so important to include mum, because there could be certain cases where, and it has happened in the past, where we've tested a father and a child alone because mother doesn't want to participate, and we get maybe only 1 or 2 regions. Now, that is not enough. 1 or 2 regions of mismatch, that is not enough for us to say conclusively that this gentleman cannot be the dad, because we need to see at least 3. And when you get situations like that where you get maybe 1 or 2 mismatches, other factors come into play. If the mum's not involved, it could be he isn't the dad, but we've just not allocated all of the mismatches against the father because we don't have the mum's DNA. Or it could be, in fact, that this man is actually related to this child, but not as its true biological father, i.e. a close male relative of this gentleman's could in fact be the true father of this child and not him. So this is why you need mum, because by including mum, you're able to sort of screen out all these other possibilities, because at the end of the day, as a DNA testing company, what we want to do is give you a result that actually means something, is conclusive, and you can go away with an answer, not 3 options. It's not a multiple choice, so that's why we do need mums involved. Now, going back for an inclusion now, so we've looked at results for alleged father 2 against these 2 children. We've now popped in data for alleged father 1. Now you can see now a sea of green, because you can see in all those regions that we have tested, all those 15 regions of DNA, he matches the child at every single one, even when it's not without any mum involved at all. If you look at the 2 top tables, we've got inclusions galore all the way across. So when we go and do the statistics for that, which we'll show you later, you'll see that it's pretty much in favour of this gentleman actually being the child's or the children's real biological father. If you look down below, the next 2 bottom tables, you'll see the mother's DNA has been incorporated. Nothing's changed. Still a sea of green. So we're absolutely certain and confident that this gentleman, alleged father 1, is indeed the true biological father of these 2 children. So let's go see the stats. So this is where, again, this is quite a useful little slide to see. We're showing you data here for percentage paternity with and without the children's mother being involved. So if you look at child 1's stats, we see without mum, so when we just looked at that first table with the child matched against alleged father 1 alone, you can see the stats have come out at 99.98% in favour of this particular man being this particular child's biological father. That's pretty good. You know, it's over 99%. Great. The likelihood ratio is saying, well, how many more times likely is it than the next man? And in this particular case, again, you've got what we call a likelihood ratio of in excess of 5,000. That's okay. It's not brilliant. In excess of 10,000 is usually a really nice figure to be working with if you're looking at numbers and you're keen on them. Now, add mum into the equation, so you go along to the right, and now you can see that percentage certainty has gone up from 99.98 to 99.9998. And that likelihood ratio has jumped from just over 5,000 to in excess of 660,000 times more likely. That's a bit more black and white, and that's what we like to see. Same for child 2. If you look at the stats for child 2, look at paternity without mum being included, you've got 99.998% in favour. Better than the first child. You know, you've got a likelihood ratio of 56,000. But again, pop mum into the equation and you've got a fabulous jump there. So you've got 99.999997% and in excess of 35.6 million. Now, when you take that into context, there's about 67 million people within the UK. How many of a certain age, etc., male or female? That's a really good statistic. So you can be pretty certain that that gentleman truly is the child's biological father. And like I said, this is why we would really like mums to be involved in the test if they can. Yes, we know they're the biological mother, but it really, really improves the results that we can generate for you. One of the other things you've probably noticed on that slide as well is that the statistics for the two children are different. You think, well, does that mean, and this is one of the questions we actually ask quite a lot when we've had cases where we've tested two children against the same man, is one of those children more my child than the other one? Because I've got 99.9 here, but I've got 99.999 on the other side. The answer is no. It just means that the particular regions that you actually matched out with the child with the higher statistics, the bigger number of 0.9s after the 99, is probably that some of those regions that you have in common are quite rare in the population. So when you're dealing with relatively rare regions of DNA, that always boosts the statistics, the numbers. At the end of the day, all the gentleman needs to worry about or be concerned about is the fact that he matched both children at every single region of DNA that we tested. And to be honest, that's why we don't always, in our reports that we produce, we don't provide all the allele designations and all the DNA profiles or the statistics and the calculations, because what we do find is that sometimes causes more confusion than help. So what you'll get from us are nice, simplified DNA test reports that we'll come on to later. Now then, we touched on different other types of testing before, and again, one of the most common ones, other than paternity and maternity, is sibling. That's probably the next most common test that you'll come across. And it might be where the father just doesn't want to play, doesn't want to be involved, or you can't find him. Okay, so what you often find is, well, this lady also has another child that we know and accept is this gentleman's true biological child. We just have a query over child number 2. So we'll say, okay, we'll do a sibling test. We do need the mum involved, and this is again where it really, really helps, because the first thing we will do is look at those two children and see which regions of DNA both of them inherited from the mother. We get rid of those, and then what we're left with is what we call obligate paternal alleles, i.e. bits of DNA that these two children could have only inherited from their true biological father. Now, if they have the same dad, they will share an awful lot of that DNA in common because they have the same biological father. So we do exactly the same thing, perform the statistics, and again on this particular slide that we've got, sibling tests with and without the mother, you'll see the difference that makes. And it's on the same two children that we just looked at earlier as well with the paternity test, but in this case we took the dad out of the equation. So for one of the children we looked at, we had a value of 91.5% in favour of the two children being full siblings without the mother's DNA being included in that analysis. When you pop the mum into the equation, that jumps from 91.5% to in excess again of 99.9%. So you can see the difference. It's so much better when mums are involved. So when she asks you that question, why do I have to take part in this test? Just let her know. It gives you a much better, much more conclusive result. And at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We don't want any grey areas in this sort of test. So back to the DNA test report. Once you get all the samples in the lab, it takes between 5 and 7 working days to go from swab to DNA test report. Now, the reports, as we said, come out as what we call a simplified test report, and that's prescribed to us by our accreditation body, UCAS, okay? Because the DNA test reports that we are producing, although behind them is a lot of great science, all the client is worried about is who took part in the test, what is the presumed relationship, and most importantly, what is the result? Is he or is he not that child's biological father? And that is what our reports clearly state, okay? We don't go through all the allele designations, all the different allele frequencies, all of that in the DNA profiles are made available, but to be honest, it doesn't really help. All the people want to know is, am I or am I not the child's father? And that's what these reports say. And we'll put up behind there an example of one of our reports just for you to look through, an example of an inclusion report, i.e. in favour of paternity, and also the opposite side of the spectrum, the exclusion report, which clearly states that this gentleman just cannot be the child's biological father. And we'll also show you some sibling reports as well, just so you can see the wording behind them and how we sort of create the different scenarios as well. But you can find a glossary of terms that we've used today on the DadCheck website. Okay, so the next section that we're going to cover very briefly is wills and probate. Every so often we get requests from solicitors or even members of the public where very sadly a member of the family has died and there is now question over paternity of some child or somebody who's in the nicest way popped out of the woodwork claiming to have something over the estate or be a child of the deceased. Those particular scenarios are obviously very upsetting, very distressing, but there are ways of working around it. One of the things is if the individual died a while ago, as in excess of a year or so, then you can probably look at extended family members. And we covered that a little bit briefly in sort of like sibling tests, grandparentage tests and things like that. So there's always ways of getting around and sort of trying to establish the biological relationship of somebody against a deceased individual, so long as those relationships, for example, his parents, if it's a gentleman who's recently deceased, for example, if his parents are available and willing to be tested, and there is no doubt whatsoever over the deceased individual's parentage, i.e. we know his dad is in fact his biological father, then we can do various tests involving the grandparents, etc. In all these situations, we have to qualify the various relationships that we are testing, because if we use the wrong questions to ask of the DNA, we're never going to get the right answer. So it's very important that we know who is related to who, how confident we are in that actual scenario before we go ahead and start doing what we call more complex testing using extended family members. However, there are certain cases where the person has died quite recently, and we can use tissue samples, or if that person has been in hospital or was in hospital before they died, it may be that the hospital has got various samples available for testing. So we're going to briefly go through that and give you some of the possible scenarios. So in the event that a gentleman has recently passed away and for some reason there is now questions over paternity of one of his children, or somebody else has come out and said, well, actually I have a child with this gentleman as well and I want my child to have some say in all of this, then if that person has died relatively recently or maybe was in hospital for a time prior to their death, then there is the opportunity of actually acquiring samples from these individuals. This way, you're testing the alleged father, his sample, against the child. It's nice and straightforward. There are no caveats regarding complex testing and qualifying relationships like in the extended family testing. It's a straightforward, plain sailing paternity test. The only thing is obviously the type of sample that we would have access to, because now the donor is deceased, he has no means of giving consent for his samples to be used. And that's why we need to know who the next of kin is or the executor of the will, so they can authorise the release of any tissues to our laboratory for testing. In those cases, there are various forms that we can go through and fill out to show that that consent is in place. Now, the tissues that are available or can be available do vary, and they do vary also in our order of preference. So the ideal scenario for a sample from a deceased individual will be a blood sample. Now, the blood samples we would need will be whole blood, stored in anticoagulants so they don't clot, but ideally not in something called heparin, which is one of these anticoagulants. All of this information we can provide, so don't worry at the moment. Also, any biopsies, any frozen tissue samples or anything like that. Again, these, especially muscle samples, contain an awful lot of DNA, so we only need a tiny, tiny little sample in order to generate enough DNA to actually perform a paternity test. Now, the least favourite or the least preferred sample is something called a paraffin-embedded tissue sample. And this is because in the way that the sample or the tissue is being preserved is to actually look after the histology, if you like, the physical appearance of the tissue itself, as opposed to the DNA and other components within it, because they're treated with all sorts of chemicals such as formaldehyde, things like that, that actually damage the DNA over time. So although we can definitely extract DNA from these sort of tissues, these paraffin-embedded samples, they're not the preferred sample type to use. So there is always a caveat in there. So of course, if we can get hold of blood samples or tissue biopsies, that is the preferred way to go. There are means of taking those if they haven't already been collected prior to death that we can advise on. And there are also couriers that we use to actually collect the samples from the hospital or the mortuary. We always advise that the mortician actually takes half of the sample and retains on their side and only sends us the other half. So if anything goes missing or if there are any problems, there's always that extra sample spare to do further analysis on if required. So this is a small, brief section on overseas surrogacy. It's not an area that we do an awful lot of work in, but it is increasing over time. We're getting a number of couples now from the UK having contracts abroad in places such as India and Georgia and Thailand as well, with surrogacy agencies over there. The couple obviously bringing the child back in, or the children back into the UK, will need to establish and prove parentage, and a DNA test will be required. The laws are fairly complex because surrogacy contracts aren't actually recognised in UK law and only legally binding in a small number of countries. And it does depend on various factors, whether or not the surrogate mother is married or not, and various other situations as well. But regardless of this, if a family or a couple are bringing their child back into the UK, they need to establish and show that either both parents are indeed the biological parents of this child, or indeed it's just the gentleman, the male, is the true biological father of the child that they're bringing back into the country. It's a fairly standard test. Everything applies as we've discussed before. It's just cheek cell swabs to be collected, but it must, because this is using to bring a child back into the country, the samples must be taken by a doctor or nurse who's going to warrant the identity of all the donors again, and of the child as well. And usually a lot of the clinics that help with the surrogacy and the whole arrangements will actually take these samples for the families themselves. Everything will be couriered back to the UK by one of our couriers. The tests again take between 5 and 7 working days, and accredited DNA test reports are produced to show that the man or the couple, the male and female of the couple, are indeed either the true biological father or the true biological parents of this child that they've brought back into the country. It's a fairly simple process. The only difference is that the child is overseas and that the surrogacy itself is not recognised by UK law. But everything else is a fairly simple and straightforward process. So that's it for this short session on DNA testing in family law. I hope you found it useful. You can find more information obviously on our website, dadcheckgold.com. But on behalf of myself, Louise Allcroft, and our company Complement Genomics Limited, trading as DadCheck, thank you very much for your time, and we hope you found it of interest.